He thought it was just a quiet alley until Keanu Reeves saw a homeless man reading one of his old, forgotten movie scripts. But when the man whispered, "I wrote this," everything changed. What Hollywood buried decades ago is about to be uncovered, and what Keanu does next will shock everyone. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The ballroom still echoed with laughter as Keanu Reeves slipped out the side door of the downtown Los Angeles hotel. He didn't say goodbye. He never liked attention, and the charity gala, though it supported a cause he believed in, had left him feeling strangely hollow. The flash of cameras, the endless small talk, the curated displays of wealth in the name of generosity. It was too much. He tugged his black jacket tighter around him, stepping into the cool night air. The sidewalks were mostly empty, save for a few cars purring by and the buzz of neon signs overhead. He walked with no destination, his footsteps echoing on the damp pavement. He often did this, disappeared into cities, finding stillness where no one expected to find it. Not far from the venue, he cut down a side alley, drawn by nothing in particular, just the quiet. Then he saw him. Under a sputtering streetlight, a man sat cross-legged on flattened cardboard. His beard was unkempt, hair streaked with gray, and he wore 3 coats layered against the night chill. But what caught Keanu's attention wasn't the man's appearance. It was what was in his hands. The man was reading, not a newspaper or magazine, a script. A worn, weathered screenplay with dog-eared corners and a broken spine, like it had been carried for years. The title on the front caught Keanu's breath. Quiet Season. Keanu froze. That script hadn't crossed his mind in years. It was one of his earliest projects, never released. The studio shelved it after a last-minute investor backed out. Most people forgot it even existed. But this man, this homeless man, was turning each page with care, mouthing the words softly, like he knew them by heart. Keanu stepped closer. The man didn't notice. He was lost in the rhythm of the story, eyes darting across the lines, as if the characters still lived inside him. "Why did you come back, Eli?" the man whispered, quoting a line from the second act. "Because I had nowhere else to go." His voice cracked on the words. Keanu stood in stunned silence. He remembered that line. It was one of the most powerful scenes in the film, one of the few moments where he, a young actor unsure of his craft, had felt like he truly connected to the character. It had been written beautifully, raw, honest. Then the man turned the page and said, almost bitterly, "They cut this scene, cowards." Keanu's heart skipped. How did he know that? The man's fingers trembled slightly as he turned to the next page, the brittle paper catching the edge of a breeze. Keanu moved a step closer, but quietly, not wanting to startle him. The alley was dim, lit only by the broken street lamp above and the flicker of passing headlights beyond its mouth. But there was a kind of sacred stillness in that space, like time had cracked open. "Dami told me it wasn't marketable," the man muttered, still unaware of the presence behind him. "They said people didn't want slow stories about broken men trying to heal. They wanted guns, explosions, wisecracks, noise." Keanu felt the words hit harder than they should have, because he remembered hearing the same thing back then. That Quiet Season was too quiet, too thoughtful, too slow. But he also remembered loving it, because it wasn't about being a hero, it was about sitting with pain. The man went on, quoting more lines, now with rising emotion. She asked him why he never called, and he said, "Because I didn't think I deserved forgiveness." His voice cracked. "I wrote that for my sister." Keanu stepped closer, heart now pounding. The script, the emotion, the intimate knowledge of the lines. Could it be? The man finally looked up. His eyes met Keanu's, and there was a long pause. A flicker of recognition passed between them, But it wasn't fame the man saw. It was memory. Connection. The moment stretched. "You recognize it?" the man asked softly. Keanu nodded. "Yeah, I was in it." The man gave a tired, crooked smile. "Funny thing, I wrote it." Keanu took a breath, then sat on the curb across from him. He didn't speak right away. The sounds of the city seemed far off now, as if this alley had folded itself into a quieter world where only two people existed. The man dropped his gaze to the script in his lap, gently tapping the cover. "Name's Raymond Ellis," he said after a moment. "Used to be something. WGA member. Sold 3 scripts in the 90s. This was supposed to be the one." Keanu searched his memory. Raymond Ellis. He hadn't remembered the name, not back then. The studio kept the writer distant during filming, too focused on marketing strategy. But now, the pieces clicked. "You vanished," Keanu said. Raymond gave a soft, humorless laugh. "I broke." Keanu stayed seated, elbows on his knees, letting the silence speak for both of them. Raymond didn't say more at first. He simply looked out into the night, toward nothing in particular. Then he exhaled, slow and deliberate, as though letting go of something he'd carried too long. "I didn't handle the collapse well," Raymond finally said. "The studio shelved the film. My agent dropped me 2 weeks later. My wife left the year after that. One day I looked around and realized I didn't even recognize the life I had. So I stopped trying to live it." Keanu listened. There was no judgment in his face, just stillness and something else. Recognition. He knew what it meant to carry grief, to disappear inward even when the cameras kept rolling. Raymond continued, voice barely above a whisper. "The funny thing is, I still believed in this story. Quiet Season was the one thing I thought might outlast me." He gently folded the script, careful not to tear the worn binding. "I found this copy in a storage unit I stopped paying rent on 6 years ago. Thought it was gone, but someone must have left the box by the gate. I've been carrying it ever since." Keanu looked at him, then at the pages resting on Raymond's lap. "You wrote something that mattered," he said softly. Raymond gave a small shrug. "Maybe, but no one saw it." Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached forward, gently tapping the cover of the script. "I did." For a brief moment, something in Raymond's shoulders softened. Then Keanu stood, brushed off his hands, and extended one toward the man. "Come on," he said. "Let's go somewhere warm." Raymond stared at the hand for a long second. The world seemed to pause. And then, he reached out and took it. Keanu took a cautious step forward, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on the man under the streetlight. The alley behind the gala was silent now, broken only by the distant echo of sirens and the occasional drip from a leaky pipe above. "Huh?" The man looked up slowly, meeting Keanu's gaze with clear, unflinching eyes. "Funny thing," the man repeated, his voice steadier now, though weathered. "I wrote this." Keanu crouched down, keeping a respectful distance. "You wrote Quiet Season?" The man gave a slow nod. "Long time ago, before everything went sideways." The script lay on a wrinkled blanket, its edges curled and stained, but the handwriting on the cover was unmistakable. Written by Thomas Langley. Keanu remembered the name. Vaguely. It had been there in the early drafts, before the film got shelved without explanation. Keanu's voice was soft. "I never knew what happened. We finished filming, then it just disappeared." Thomas nodded again, almost as if he'd been waiting for someone to say that. "They buried it. Buried me. Said I was too difficult, too insubordinate." The bitterness in the word didn't last long. His eyes returned to the script and he touched one page gently, almost with reverence. "This story was everything to me. I put pieces of my mother in it, my brother, myself. I thought maybe..." just maybe, it could matter. Keanu sat down against the brick wall, rain-soaked concrete pressing into his back. He didn't rush the conversation. The man in front of him wasn't asking for pity. He was stating facts, worn down by time and silence. "I never got a chance to ask," Keanu said after a moment. "Why this script? Why now?" Thomas's eyes lit up, a flicker of something undimmed by the years. "Because it was mine, and it mattered. Until they took everything." Keanu's throat tightened. He had lived through studio politics, PR spins, canceled projects, but this felt different. This was a man robbed not just of a career, but of the belief that his voice had value. "Have you eaten?" Keanu asked quietly. Thomas shook his head. "Not tonight." "But I'm fine." Keanu reached into his coat. "Let me help." But Thomas held up a hand. "I don't want your money, just—" He paused, looking embarrassed for the first time. "You got an extra coat? This one's losing the fight." Keanu nodded and stood, unzipping his own black jacket. It wasn't much, just something he'd grabbed to escape the heat of the gala, but it was warm and dry. He offered it without hesitation. Thomas slipped it on slowly, as if it were something sacred. "Thank you." Keanu didn't ask anything more. He nodded, then turned to go. But a few steps down the alley, he stopped. He glanced back once. Thomas was already flipping to the next page, mouthing a line Keanu hadn't heard in over a decade. And somehow, in that moment, it sounded more powerful than it ever had on set. Keanu walked into the night, heart unsettled. The further Keanu walked, the louder the city seemed to grow around him. Horns blaring in the distance, voices from nearby bars, the low hum of traffic returning to the boulevard. But none of it registered. His thoughts were still with the man in the alley, wrapped in his coat, cradling the forgotten script like something holy. By the time he reached the valet line outside the gala, Keanu wasn't thinking about the event he'd left or the cameras that had missed his exit. He was thinking about the phrase Thomas had used. They took everything. Keanu had heard those words before, from actors who never got their break, from stuntmen who aged out, from women whose voices were silenced by gatekeepers. But this felt personal. That script, Quiet Season, wasn't just another role. It had meant something to him once, a small, quiet film about grief and hope. He had poured himself into it when he was younger, and still unsure of where he belonged in Hollywood. And then, without explanation, it had been shelved. The public never saw it. He never asked why. Back in his home office, Keanu pulled out an old storage box from a dusty shelf. He hadn't looked at these materials in years. Early drafts, storyboards, scribbled notes in the margins, and there it was, a coffee-stained folder marked Quiet Season. Final draft. Inside was a letter from the production company, dated just a month before post-production ended. Project no longer aligned with studio direction. That had been the official story. Now, a decade later, the real one had come to life in an alley. Keanu reread the letter, then the script pages. It all came back. The emotional monologue in the final scene. The quiet stillness between two broken characters. The way the story whispered rather than shouted. Thomas Langley had written something beautiful, something vulnerable. He picked up his phone and searched the name. Nothing recent, just a few film credits from the early 2000s, a couple of screenwriting panels, and then nothing. One article hinted at a falling out with a studio executive, but the details were vague. Keanu stared at the screen, jaw tight. How could someone so talented vanish? He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in thought. Part of him wanted to charge into a studio office, demand answers. But this wasn't about ego. It wasn't about revenge. It was about someone who had told a story the world never heard and paid the price. His eyes shifted toward the script again. In the margins of one scene, someone had written in Thomas's neat cursive, "Even silence is a kind of scream." That line stayed with Keanu for the rest of the night. The next morning, Keanu found himself pacing his living room, the city already buzzing outside the windows. He hadn't slept much. He kept seeing Thomas's eyes, the way they carried both defeat and defiance, like a candle still burning after the room had gone dark. He didn't know why it mattered so much. He'd met countless people over the years, heard their stories, signed their scripts, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was the way Thomas refused pity, or the way he quoted lines from Quiet Season with such conviction, as if the story was still alive inside him. Keanu decided to go back. He returned to the alley just before noon, wearing plain clothes and sunglasses. The sun was harsh now, revealing cracks in the pavement and graffiti-covered dumpsters, but the spot beneath the flickering streetlight was empty. No blanket, no Thomas. Keanu looked around, unsure what to do. He walked the block. Nothing. He checked behind the diner where he'd bought the sandwich. A cook said he sometimes saw a guy with a limp reading old papers near the bridge. Keanu made his way there, scanning each bench, each shadow. And then, just past the overpass, he spotted him. Thomas sat cross-legged on a crate, scribbling something on the back of a napkin. The script was open beside him, weighted down with a stone. Keanu approached slowly. "Hey," he said gently. Thomas looked up. Recognition sparked in his face, but so did hesitation. "Didn't think I'd see you again," Thomas said. "I came back," Keanu replied. "Wanted to ask more about the script and about you." Thomas looked away, brushing a speck of dirt off his jeans. "Not much to tell. I wrote. They shelved it. I spoke up. They erased me." Keanu nodded, taking a seat on the curb nearby. "But why hold on to it all these years?" he asked. "Why keep reading it, memorizing it?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked out at the freeway above them, cars roaring by like time itself. "Because it was honest," he finally said. "The only thing I ever wrote that didn't try to impress anyone. Just told the truth. About grief, about silence, about how we survive things we don't talk about." Keanu listened closely. "They said it was too small," Thomas added. "Too sad, not commercial. But I knew it mattered. And when they took it, they didn't just kill a project. They killed something in me." For a moment, neither man spoke. Keanu looked down at the pages, weathered and worn. The edges were curled, the ink faded. But the words were still there, still fighting to be heard. "I'm sorry," Keanu said, "for what they did. For not asking sooner." Thomas gave a faint smile. "You didn't owe me anything. You showed up when you didn't have to. That counts for something." Keanu stood and offered his hand. "Can I buy you lunch?" Thomas shook his head, but not out of pride. "Only if it comes with a conversation," he said. "Real one, not a pitch." Keanu smiled. "Deal." The rain had started to fall in soft taps against the windows of Keanu's study as he stood motionless in front of an old wooden cabinet. He opened the bottom drawer slowly, like he was touching something sacred. Inside, stacked between archived scripts and production stills, was a manila folder labeled with a faded sticker. His hands lingered on it before pulling it free. Keanu laid the folder on his desk and opened it. Inside were aged pages curled at the corners, a few handwritten notes in the margins, and a black and white photo from set. Him, in costume, sitting quietly on a bench in the fog. He hadn't seen this image in years. The stillness of that moment came rushing back, and so did the ache. He remembered the film vividly. It was called Quiet Season, a drama about a grieving man who had retreated into the mountains after losing his wife in a car crash. It wasn't flashy. There were no fight scenes, no heroic arcs, just long silences, nature, the subtle tension between loss and healing. He had poured his heart into the role. The director had called it his most nuanced work to date, and then it vanished. The studio cited poor test screening results, They claimed it was too slow, too introspective, not commercially viable. The official statement said the project was being shelved due to post-production difficulties. No premiere, no press tour, no home release. Nothing. Just a line in his filmography that ended with asterisks. But Keanu had always felt something was off. There was never a post-mortem meeting, no final cut review, just silence. It was like the film had been erased by someone who wanted it gone. He flipped through the pages of the old script. Thomas Langley's name wasn't on it, at least not officially. The credited writer had been someone named Bryce Halpern, a studio favorite back then. But Keanu remembered the original drafts had felt different, more raw, more honest. Somewhere along the way, the tone had shifted. Scenes he loved had disappeared during the shoot. Others were rewritten last minute. Could Thomas have been the original writer? Was Quiet Season his story all along? Keanu leaned back in his chair, gripping the folder with both hands. He thought of the man under the streetlight, the tremble in his voice as he recited those lines, the way he said, "Because it was mine." He wasn't just reading the script. He was reliving it. A cold unease settled over Keanu. If Thomas was telling the truth, then someone had stolen his story, and worse, someone had made sure it never saw the light of day. Keanu stayed up well past midnight, the script sprawled across his desk like a jigsaw puzzle of memories. He scanned the familiar lines, comparing them with what he remembered filming. There were clear discrepancies, certain moments that had felt emotionally honest on set, scenes about solitude, quiet conversations with nature, a monologue about grief under the stars, had all been cut or watered down. His mind drifted back to those days on set. The crew had been respectful, but the energy was odd. The producer had grown increasingly tense. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Keanu had chalked it up to budget concerns or studio pressure. Now, he wondered if it had been something more, something deliberate. He remembered one specific day. The director, a thoughtful man named Elliot Moran, had gotten into a heated argument with someone from the studio. Keanu had caught only a few words: authorial rights, unapproved changes, and not what we promised. The next day, Elliot was quieter, more distant. 2 weeks later, the production wrapped early. No one said why. Keanu reached for a stack of old emails, printed and kept in the same drawer. He flipped through them until he found one from Elliot, dated July 1995. "They're forcing me to make edits that don't feel right. I tried to fight it, but it's like the story doesn't belong to us anymore." The sentence hit hard, like the breath had been knocked out of it. Keanu rubbed his temples and looked back at the script. If Thomas Langley had written this, if he had been the soul behind the original idea, it meant his name had been erased, not just from the credits, but from the legacy of the film itself. His voice had been silenced in the very story he created. And now, nearly 3 decades later, Keanu had found him in an alley, homeless and forgotten, clinging to the last thing that was ever truly his. Why? What could Thomas have done to deserve this kind of blacklisting? Keanu stood, restless. The questions wouldn't stop swirling. He had to know more. He had to find out the truth. As he packed the old folder away, a line from the film came back to him. It was one of his favorites, a quiet moment between the main character and a stranger in the woods. Sometimes the stories that vanish leave the deepest echoes. That line had never made it to the final cut, but Thomas hadn't forgotten it. Neither had Keanu. And now, it was time to find out why those echoes had been buried, who had silenced them, and why they were finally starting to rise again. The next morning, Keanu woke early, the weight of the script still pressing on his mind. He stared out at the ocean from his porch, watching the horizon blur into a gray-blue haze. His coffee sat untouched beside him. The same line kept echoing in his thoughts. "Funny thing, I wrote this He went back inside and pulled out an old storage box from the back of his closet. Inside were personal copies of early film projects, letters, mementos, and a few forgotten artifacts from his years of working with independent directors. At the bottom was a thick, rubber-banded packet, his original call sheets, notes, and casting breakdowns for Quiet Season. He flipped through them methodically, looking for one name. Thomas Langley. Wasn't there? Writer credit listed only. Story by Alan Richter. Final screenplay by Aaron Keller. Neither of whom had appeared on the original pitch materials Keanu remembered reading when he first signed on. It sent a chill through him. He pulled up his laptop, opened an archived email folder, and searched the keywords original script, Quiet Season, and Langley. Nothing definitive, but there was one odd email from an old assistant, just a vague reference. The Langley issue, legal says no comment. Keller's contract holds. Keanu stared at the screen, his gut clenched. He knew how this business worked, how credits could be reassigned, how a person could be erased if they rubbed the wrong executive the wrong way. And suddenly, that alley, that man under the flickering streetlight, didn't seem random at all. He grabbed his keys. Before he could second-guess it, he was on the road, heading back to downtown Los Angeles. The alley had emptied by the time he arrived. Morning sunlight spilled unevenly between the buildings, highlighting the scuff marks on the sidewalk where Thomas had been sitting. The folding chair was gone. So was the blanket. No sign of the script. But Keanu noticed something taped to the side of a nearby power box. Barely legible handwriting on a scrap of receipt paper. To the man who remembered. Thank you for seeing me. That was it. No name, no signature. But Keanu knew. He folded the note carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. This wasn't over. If Thomas Langley really was the original writer of Quiet Season, Keanu wasn't going to let him disappear again. Not like the film had. Not like so many voices in this town did when power and pride got in the way of truth. Oh, he would find out what happened. And this time, someone would listen. The next morning, Keanu sat in his kitchen, a quiet cup of coffee in hand, but his thoughts were miles away. He couldn't stop seeing the man's face. Thomas Langley. The name had haunted him through the night. There was something about the clarity in Thomas's voice, the weight of his words, that had refused to leave Keanu's mind. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his old contacts. After several dead ends, he finally landed on one name he hadn't called in years: Vincent Harlow. Vincent was a retired talent agent now living in a quiet corner of Sonoma. Back in the 90s, Vincent had been one of the few agents in Hollywood who actually protected writers, not just used them. If anyone would remember Thomas Langley, it was him. Keanu tapped the screen and waited. The line rang 3 times before a raspy voice answered. "Keanu Reeves, I must be dreaming." Keanu smiled faintly. "Hey, Vincent, I need to ask you about someone." Thomas Langley. There was a pause, not long, but heavy. "Langley," Vincent repeated slowly. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in over 2 decades. Why are you asking about him?" Keanu explained everything. Seeing the man in the alley, the script, the line Thomas had spoken. He kept his voice steady, but even over the phone, Vincent sensed something deeper stirring beneath the surface. Don rose. "Pomash was brilliant," Vincent finally said. "Too good for the business, maybe. He came up with that generation of writers in the early 90s. Scraw talent, emotional precision. But he didn't play the politics." Keanu leaned forward, his elbows on the counter. "What happened to him?" "Depends on who you ask," Vincent said. "Some say drugs. Others say he had a breakdown after a studio head, Ron Castor, cut him off. There were whispers back then. Thomas refused to rewrite something Ron wanted dumbed down. The next thing we knew, his contracts dried up, overnight. It was like he'd been erased." Ron Castor, Keanu repeated. The name came with a bitter aftertaste. He remembered him. A man who smiled with his teeth, but not his eyes. Vincent sighed. Thomas was even up for an indie screenplay award once. I remember the buzz. He had fire in his work. Real pain, real beauty. But you cross someone like Ron, and suddenly, the world forgets you existed. Keanu felt his stomach twist. This wasn't just about a forgotten writer. This was about a system that had made sure someone with something to say was silenced. After the call ended, Keanu sat for a long while, staring out at the horizon beyond his glass patio doors. The ocean moved, relentless and quiet, like memory itself. He went into his office and opened an old metal file drawer where he kept memorabilia from his earlier roles, scripts, notes, film festival badges. After several minutes of digging, he pulled out a creased press packet for Quiet Season. Inside was a single sheet with production credits. There it was, screenplay by Thomas Langley. Why hadn't he noticed before? Or had he simply forgotten like everyone else? The name had meant nothing to him back then. He'd been younger, moving from one role to the next, working on instinct more than reflection. But now that he saw it, now that he knew, the coincidence hit like a thunderclap. The man who wrote that quietly profound story of loss and silence had ended up silenced himself. Keanu couldn't let it sit. He picked up the phone again. This time, he called Lena Price, a former film archivist who now worked as a freelance consultant for industry investigations. Lena had helped him years ago track down missing footage from a documentary. She had access to studio logs most people never saw. Thomas Langley, she repeated. You've picked a deep cut, Keanu. I need everything you can find, he said, and I need to know why his name vanished. She didn't hesitate. Give me 24 hours. He thanked her and hung up. By late evening, Lena had sent a file. It wasn't large, but what it held made Keanu's chest tighten. Thomas had been represented by a small agency until 1996. He'd been attached to 5 scripts, 4 optioned, 1 in production. After Quiet Season, there was a sharp drop. No official notes, no public fallout. But internally, Lena found redacted memos from Paramount referencing a behavior concern flagged by executive Castor. That memo had gone to every major studio. Blacklist. Keanu closed his eyes. This wasn't a story about obscurity. This was erasure, deliberate, systemic, executed with precision. He thought of the man in the alley, how he clutched that script like it was a limb he'd lost, how he still recited its lines with conviction. Keanu now knew what the world had chosen to forget, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to rage, not for himself, but for a voice that had been forced into silence. Keanu stepped outside onto his balcony, the night air brushing his skin. In his hand was the worn packet of notes Lena had sent, printed out and highlighted. His thumb kept brushing over one name, Castor, a name he hadn't heard in years. Daniel Castor had been a major executive in the 90s, notorious for controlling narratives, both on-screen and off. Keanu had worked with him once, briefly. Castor had power then, the kind that didn't need to scream to be felt. He could end a career with a phone call, and often did. Now, years later, it seemed that Thomas Langley had been one of those names struck off. Keanu wondered how many others there had been. He stared out at the city, bright, pulsing, indifferent. Somewhere out there, Thomas was probably curled up under cardboard, still guarding the last script that bore his name. A man who once had meetings in those buildings, whose words had been read by actors, who was supposed to have mattered. Keanu turned back inside. On his desk sat a fresh legal pad. He picked up a pen and wrote just 3 words. Find him again. This wasn't going to be a one-time act of kindness. This was a reckoning. He knew the industry wouldn't like it. People would say he was chasing ghosts. But he wasn't. He was chasing the truth. He called Maya, his current assistant, and asked her to clear the next morning. "I want to find someone," he said simply, "and I think we need to start with the Writers Guild archive." Maya hesitated. "Do you think he wants to be found?" Keanu paused. "He didn't ask to be erased." There was silence on the line. Then Maya said, "I'll set it up." That night, Keanu couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, replaying lines from Quiet Season, remembering the feeling he had on set, how every word had felt real, how raw that performance had been. He'd always felt the movie died too quietly. Now he understood. It hadn't died. It had been buried, along with the man who wrote it. And Keanu knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his chest, that it was time to dig it back up. The city looked different in the early morning light, less chaotic, more exposed. Keanu returned to the alley 3 days later, the place where the echoes of something forgotten had first stirred inside him. He carried a simple bag with a thermos of coffee, a clean pair of socks, and a spare wool coat. The flickering streetlight was still there, casting its weak orange hue over damp concrete and torn posters. But the man, the one who had haunted Keanu's thoughts since that night, was gone. To relax. He stood there for a long moment, uncertain whether to wait or walk. Then a rusted food truck pulled in along the curb. It smelled of frying eggs and old grease. The cook, a man in his 50s with a worn Dodgers cap and a gentle squint, opened the side window and called out, "You looking for the guy with the papers?" Keanu turned. "Yeah, you've seen him?" The cook nodded. "Yeah, a couple times. Quiet, reads all the time. He never stays in one place long, though." Keanu walked over. "Do you know where he might have gone?" The man wiped his hands on a rag, thoughtful. "He's not the kind you lose easy. Got a routine, believe it or not. Sometimes he stays at the old shelter near Fairfax. Doesn't like crowds, though. You might catch him early or late." Keanu thanked him, and as he walked away, the cook called after him, "Hey, he's sharper than most, talks like a professor. Don't let the coat fool you." That sentence stuck with Keanu all the way to Fairfax. The shelter was tucked between a pawn shop and a boarded-up laundromat. A faded mural of clasped hands stretched across its side wall. Inside, the lighting was soft, almost apologetic. He stepped through quietly, scanning the rows of bunks and folding chairs. Most people were asleep, or staring into space. Then he saw him. Thomas Langley sat at a plastic table near the far wall, hunched over a tattered composition notebook. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately, pressing a blue pen to each page as if carving meaning into the paper itself. He looked thinner than Keanu remembered, like someone who hadn't slept fully in days. Keanu approached, careful not to startle him. Thomas didn't look up. "Didn't expect you back," he said quietly. "I couldn't forget," Keanu replied, taking a seat beside him. "I brought coffee." Thomas chuckled under his breath, eyes still on the page. "Not many people come back." Keanu opened the thermos and poured into 2 paper cups. "I want to hear the whole story. I'm listening." Thomas closed his notebook slowly. For a moment, the silence between them felt fragile. Then, as if lifting a curtain on a stage long shut down, he looked Keanu in the eye. "I used to think the story mattered more than the writer," he said, "until they erased both." Keanu didn't speak. He let Thomas fill the space with whatever words came next, giving him the kind of listening that wasn't just polite. It was reverent. The kind you give to someone who's gone unheard for far too long. Thomas took a sip of the coffee, eyes distant. "I wasn't always like this," he said quietly. "You probably figured that out already. I had an apartment in Westwood, a beat-up '89 Corolla, and a stack of rejection letters I used to laugh at." He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the notebook. But Quiet Season, that one was different. It came from someplace deeper. It wasn't about selling tickets. It was about what silence does to people. how it either protects us or destroys us. I wrote it after losing my brother. Car crash, drunk driver. Keanu nodded slowly, remembering his own feeling when he read that script years ago. How raw and unpolished it had been, and how deeply it had cut. I got lucky, Thomas continued. That script got picked up. They let me on set. I met you once, briefly. You shook my hand and told me the story was beautiful. Keanu glanced over, stunned. I don't remember that. I didn't expect you to. You were working non-stop. But that moment, it was everything to me. And then, after the test screenings, poof. He leaned back against the wall. There was a studio exec. Big guy, big voice. Didn't like how I answered his notes. Said I had an attitude problem. I tried to stand up for the integrity of the piece. Told him silence was the point, that it didn't need a dramatic ending or extra explosions. He didn't like that. Thomas paused, eyes narrowing as if trying to see that memory more clearly. I wasn't fired. That would have been too kind. They just stopped returning calls. My name was quietly removed from the press kits. The WGA listing vanished. I tried to speak out once, but suddenly I was unstable. There were whispers. Keanu clenched his jaw. They blacklisted you. Thomas shrugged. I didn't think they could, but I started noticing I couldn't get meetings. Friends stopped answering. Then came the drinking. Then came the depression. Then the eviction. I lost everything, slowly, until I couldn't remember where the losing even began. For a moment, Keanu sat in silence, absorbing it all. He looked at the man beside him. Not just a victim of bad luck or poor decisions, but of a system that chewed up quiet brilliance and spit it out. And all these years, Keanu asked, you kept the script? Thomas reached into a small canvas bag at his feet. From inside, he pulled out a folder even more weathered than the one Keanu had found. Every word I ever wrote, every draft. I rewrote it in my head 1,000 times. Keanu took the folder gently, as if holding something sacred. I never stopped believing in it, Thomas said, voice breaking. Even when no one else did. Keanu sat quietly with the folder in his lap, running his fingers over the worn edges. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The murmur of the shelter hummed faintly in the background. Soft voices, the clink of plastic trays, the occasional shuffle of tired feet. It was a fragile kind of peace. But for Thomas, it was the first time in years someone had looked at him without pity. I've been trying to understand why this story, Keanu finally said. Why not move on? Write something else. Thomas leaned forward, eyes tired but sharp. Because this was the one that mattered. The one where I left a piece of my soul on the page. You only get one of those. If you're lucky. Keanu looked up, nodding slowly. I think I understand now. Thomas chuckled, low and dry. Do you really? You've lived on the other side of the glass for so long. It's different there. Maybe, Keanu replied. But I've lost things too. People, moments, projects that were supposed to mean something. I just never thought one of them would come back to me like this. A pause hung between them, heavy with meaning. Then Keanu said, let me do something with this. Thomas raised an eyebrow. What, you want to shoot it again? You think they'll listen to you just because you've got a few billion-dollar franchises under your belt? Keanu didn't flinch. Maybe they won't listen, but they'll hear me. That's enough to start. Thomas studied him, searching his face for any trace of condescension or pity. He found none. I'm not looking for charity, he said. I know, Keanu replied. And I'm not offering any. They shook hands, not with ceremony, but with the quiet respect of two men who had both seen how easily the world could forget you. Keanu stood, then hesitated. On condition, he added. You come with me, at least for a little while. I want you in the room when I talk to them. Thomas blinked, startled. They won't let me in. Then we'll make them. For the first time in a long time, Thomas Langley smiled, an unsteady, weathered thing, but real. Not because he was saved, but because someone finally believed he didn't need to be rescued. Just remembered. Amos's voice was steady, but it carried the weight of years that had gone unspoken. They sat at a quiet corner of the shelter courtyard, dusk settling around them in soft amber light. Keanu listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the man who once wrote the words that still echoed in his memory. Thomas looked down at the notebook in his lap. His fingers gently traced the edge of the pages as if he were holding something fragile. "It started in '94, he said. "I was working with a small production outfit called Phoenix Harbor. Nothing flashy, just a handful of us who believed in storytelling for the sake of healing." He glanced up, watching a bird settle on a fence post nearby. "I wrote Quiet Season after my best friend, Alan, passed away from ALS. He was 35. We grew up together. He was the one who taught me to sit in silence and listen, to feel grief like a river that doesn't dry up but changes course." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's why the film felt so still. It didn't rush." Tomas allowed a faint smile. "Exactly. It wasn't meant to entertain, it was meant to breathe. We shot the first draft around an orchard in Napa Valley, guerrilla style, but then a studio executive got wind of it, a man named Dean Morrow. He saw Keanu's name on the potential cast list and thought it could be repackaged as a psychological thriller, add some guns, kill off the main character in the third act." Thomas laughed bitterly. "They wanted to call it Dead Season. Can you imagine?" Keanu's expression darkened. He remembered the studio notes he once found confusing. Suggestions to heighten tension and remove ambiguity. At the time, he thought it was just normal development talk. He didn't realize someone had been fighting behind the scenes. "I refused," Thomas said. "I told them I wouldn't change a single line of the third act. It was about Alan's last words, written into the script like a whisper. They said I was being precious, that I was unprofessional. Difficult." His jaw clenched. "That's when it started. The meetings got canceled, my rep dropped me, the executive producer ghosted. I was told the film was postponed, then shelved. I didn't even get to say goodbye to the editor." Keanu shifted slightly. "And after that?" Thomas's voice lowered. "After that, I was told by someone I trusted, off the record, that Dean had called me unstable and unfit for collaboration, said I had outbursts, mood swings, that I'd been using." Keanu blinked. "Was it true?" Keanu Reeves shook his head. "I had one drink at the wrap party, that's it. But in this business, even a rumor is enough." The silence between them was heavy, a kind of mourning that had no name. "Nigel," he said grimly. "Nobody did take my film," Thomas said finally. "They took my name, my future, and I let them. I didn't know how to fight back. I tried for a while, sent letters, cold people, but no one wanted to be associated with me anymore." He looked up, his eyes red but dry. "Eventually I stopped writing, sold everything, lived in a car for 3 years before it was towed. Since then, I've floated between cities, shelters, parks. That script is all I have left that proves I ever mattered." Keanu didn't say anything. He simply reached out and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You still matter," he said quietly. Thomas exhaled shakily, as if that single sentence loosened something that had been locked for decades. Keanu sat back slightly, letting the weight of Thomas's words settle in. The courtyard around them was nearly empty now, just the occasional shuffle of footsteps or distant cough echoing off the shelter walls. The sky had faded to navy blue, the stars beginning to blink into place, but neither of them moved. There was something sacred about this moment, like unearthing a story that had been buried alive. "I used to believe," Thomas said quietly, "that justice had a clock. that if I waited long enough, someone would come back and make it right. But years go by, and silence doesn't bring justice. It just turns into dust. Keanu folded his hands together, elbows resting on his knees. You never tried to submit anything else? I did, Thomas said. Under a pseudonym, twice. One got optioned, but they shelved it. The other? I think it ended up in a slush pile in a storage unit somewhere in Burbank. He chuckled dryly. It's funny. I was never looking to be famous. Just wanted to write stories that made people stop and feel something. Keanu thought of all the scripts that had passed through his own hands over the years. Some brilliant, some shallow, many forgotten. And here was a man, half invisible to the world now, who once wrote something that still lingered in his own memory. Thomas, Keanu said slowly, do you still have the original copy of Quiet Season? The whole thing? Thomas nodded, patting his bag. It's in here. Pages are fraying at the corners. Coffee stains, pencil notes, the word. Would you let me read it again? Keanu asked. Thomas looked at him like he was trying to gauge whether the question was genuine. I've thought about burning it more times than I can count, he said. But something always stopped me. Maybe I was waiting for someone to ask. He pulled out a manila folder, wrapped in plastic to protect it from weather, and handed it over. Keanu accepted it with both hands, careful not to damage the edges. I don't know what you'll find in there, Thomas said, his voice low. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just the echo of someone I used to be. Keanu didn't look down at the pages yet. He kept his eyes on Thomas. Or maybe it's exactly what the world needs to see now. A long pause. Then Thomas nodded. If you really believe that, then read it. But not out of pity. Read it because you remember the silence it held. I do, Keanu said. Thomas leaned back, a rare moment of rest crossing his face. You know, when I saw you in that alley, I thought I was hallucinating. I didn't think anyone from that time remembered me. But now I think maybe I wasn't meant to be remembered by everyone, just by the right person. Keanu gave a soft smile. Then let's remember it together. They sat in silence for a moment longer, the air growing colder, but something had shifted, something fragile and alive, stirring beneath the quiet. Later that night, Keanu sat alone in his home office with the script laid out in front of him. He didn't turn on the main lights. Instead, a soft desk lamp cast a warm glow across the yellowed pages. The title was still written in ink across the cover. Quiet Season by Thomas Langley. Beneath it, faded pencil marks, for Henry, a dedication that added new weight to every line. Keanu flipped the pages slowly, reading each word with reverence. It was all there. The same aching stillness. The pauses between dialogue that meant more than the words themselves. The tension, the sorrow, the gentle moments of human kindness that stitched the story together. But something else stood out now. The emotion wasn't just in the story. It was in the bones of the script. Every sentence breathed with the grief of someone who had poured his soul into it. It was raw, unpolished in some places, but deeply, fiercely real. Keanu set the final page down and closed his eyes. This wasn't just a script someone buried. It was a voice someone tried to silence. And now, after all these years, it had been heard again, not by an industry, not by critics, but by someone who wouldn't let it die. Not this time. Keanu Reeves sat at the edge of his private production office in Hollywood, the morning light falling in long slants through half-closed blinds. His phone lay face down on the desk. The world outside buzzed with energy, agents, scripts, deals, premieres. But inside this room, silence ruled. It was a silence he had learned to respect. A silence that mirrored the title of a film most people had never heard of. Thomas Langley stood near the entrance, holding the sleeves of a donated cardigan that still bore a faint thrift store tag. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from uncertainty. For the first time in years, someone had asked to hear his truth. Not a court, not a journalist, not even a therapist. Just one man who happened to be the film's long-forgotten lead. "I don't know if I can watch it," Thomas murmured. "You don't have to say anything," Keanu replied softly, motioning to the small screening setup they'd arranged, an old flat screen hooked to a hard drive that Keanu had dug out of his personal archive the night before. "Just sit with it," Thomas nodded. He walked with measured steps toward the leather couch and slowly eased himself down, his posture unsure. Across from him, a young assistant named Naomi sat cross-legged with a laptop on her knees, the one Keanu had quietly trusted with the restoration process. She didn't speak, only clicked a few keys. The screen blinked. A black slate appeared. The title came up in stark white. Quiet Season. Unreleased. Rough cut. 1995. Then came the first scene. Muted tones. A beach at dawn. A man in his 30s sitting alone on the sand, his face drawn and eyes red, clutching a letter. He didn't speak for nearly a minute. Just breathed. Wind, gulls, distant waves, nature score. Keanu watched himself on screen, 2 decades younger, but emotionally stripped bare. Thomas leaned forward unconsciously, elbows on knees, eyes fixed. The scenes unfolded like poetry, a grieving widower finding new meaning in silence. A community garden where no one talked, but everyone healed. A child drawing on the sidewalk with chalk instead of words. No cheap drama, no forced plot, just feeling and stillness. Thomas reached for his face and realized too late that tears were sliding down his cheeks. He wiped them with the back of his hand, embarrassed, but Keanu said nothing. He felt them too, in his own way. The film hadn't been perfect, but it had been real, and that, in Hollywood, was a miracle. Keanu leaned forward and whispered, "You wrote this with your whole soul." Thomas closed his eyes, and they buried it. Naomi pressed pause. The screen froze on a quiet frame, Keanu's character planting a sapling next to a weathered gravestone. Thomas sat back, his shoulders rising, then slumping, as if some invisible weight had shifted. His voice came low, gravelly. "That scene was written after I scattered my brother's ashes. He died before I finished the script. ALS. He used to say that silence isn't absence, it's memory taking its time." Keanu said nothing for a moment, then nodded. "It shows. Every frame carries that." Thomas looked away, eyes glassy but sharp. "You know what they told me when they shelved it? That it was too slow, too quiet. People don't pay for grief, they said. But it wasn't meant to be sold like popcorn. It was meant to sit in people's hearts." Naomi resumed the footage. The scenes moved faster now, the healing arc, the slow moments of human reconnection, the shot of Keanu sitting beside an old man, both watching a kite rise into a hazy sky, saying nothing, just being there. The way the scene lingered, unapologetically long, felt like rebellion against everything flashy and hollow in the industry. Thomas shook his head slowly. "I remember them pulling me into a room and saying if I just rewrote the third act into a revenge plot, they'd greenlight the whole thing. I said no." "And that's when they shut the door on you?" Keanu asked. Thomas gave a half smile. "It was more than that. They blacklisted me. Whispers about being difficult, unstable. After a while, no one returned calls. My name vanished from projects I'd worked on. Then came the eviction, the isolation. I started drinking, stopped writing. At some point, I stopped even talking." He stared at the frozen frame again. Naomi looked from Thomas to Keanu, uncertain. Keanu gave her a silent nod. She understood, stood up, and quietly exited the room. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't know how we let it happen. I don't know why no one fought harder for it. For you." Thomas let out a bitter breath. Because I wasn't important enough to them. Just another writer with a sad little story. I didn't matter. Keanu turned to face him fully. You mattered to me. You still do. That script, it stayed with me all these years, even when I forgot why. I felt something when I shot those scenes. Something honest. And now I know it's because you bled into every word. Thomas looked down, voice almost a whisper. Do you think it's too late? Keanu didn't answer right away. He stared at the frozen image again. Then, softly, not if we do something now. Thomas glanced around the office, his eyes resting on the shelves lined with film reels, scripts, and memorabilia. You built something good here, he said quietly. You kept going. Keanu leaned back. I kept going because people believed in me at the right time. If someone like you hadn't written Quiet Season, I might not have seen what storytelling could really do. That script changed me. Thomas's mouth quirked, the barest hint of a smile. You think it's still worth anything? Keanu nodded slowly. I do. But that's not what matters most right now. What matters is if you still have something to say. Thomas stared down at his composition notebook, the same one Keanu had seen in the shelter. He opened it, thumbing through scribbled margins and faded ink. I never really stopped writing, just stopped showing anyone. Keanu reached for his phone and tapped a contact. Naomi, can you come back in? Moments later, she stepped through the door, eyebrows raised. What's up? Keanu looked at Thomas. Would you be willing to read it aloud? Thomas hesitated. His fingers trembled slightly on the cover. I'm not used to having an audience. You're not performing, Keanu said. You're reclaiming something. Thomas opened the notebook. His voice was thin at first, but then it deepened, settled. The words were raw. A short monologue about a boy visiting his father's grave, unsure whether to speak or just listen. Another scene followed, two strangers on a park bench sharing silence more honest than words. By the time he reached the last page, Naomi had tears in her eyes. She spoke softly. That's beautiful. Keanu nodded. It's more than that. It's needed. Thomas's eyes stayed on the final line he had written. It's the only thing I never let them take. Keanu tapped the notebook. Then let's build something from it. Together. Thomas looked up, wary. You'd risk your name for mine? I'm not risking anything, Keanu replied. I'm setting the record straight. A quiet stillness settled between them. Then Thomas spoke again, voice barely audible. Okay. Keanu stood and extended a hand. Then let's bring Quiet Season back, the way it was meant to be. Thomas looked at the hand for a moment, then took it with a firm grip that surprised them both. In that simple gesture, something shifted, not just a promise, but a reckoning. The story that had been buried was stirring again, and the man who had once been erased was finally beginning to reappear, not as a ghost of the past, but as a writer with something left to say. Keanu sat in his home office, watching the morning sun struggle through the marine layer that often blanketed Malibu. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating just a second before sending the email. It was addressed to an executive contact at Eastridge Pictures, the same studio that once funded Quiet Season. The message was short, professional, and calm, simply requesting a meeting to discuss an old, shelved project. He didn't mention Thomas by name, not yet. By the end of the day, the studio's legal team replied. The tone was courteous, but cautious. They asked for clarification. Keanu followed up with a brief reference to Quiet Season and said he was revisiting the archival status of the film for artistic purposes. He knew how to phrase things to avoid raising alarms, but the moment the title was mentioned, the response changed. 3 days later, Keanu walked into the sterile glass building in Century City. His assistant stayed in the lobby. He was escorted to a sleek conference room where 2 legal counsels and 1 executive assistant waited, along with someone he hadn't expected. Dean Mercer, the former VP of Development, now President of Production. Dean's silver hair had thinned, but his presence was as cold and guarded as ever. "Keanu," Dean said, standing just long enough for a handshake he didn't really mean. "Didn't expect to see you digging through our vault." Keanu remained standing. "It's about quiet season. I'd like to discuss rights, restoration, and possible release." Dean raised an eyebrow and smiled, but there was no humor in it. "We didn't bury that film for fun. It failed testing, remember? And the material, it was delicate." Keanu's voice was steady. "I've rewatched it. It wasn't just delicate, it was brave." Dean leaned back in his chair, "And liability heavy." The room went quiet for a moment. One of the lawyers shifted in her seat, watching Keanu carefully. Keanu continued. "A writer came forward, the one who originally submitted the script. His name is Thomas Langley." Now Dean's expression changed. "Him. Says you stripped him of credit, blacklisted him, buried the film when he wouldn't change the story." Dean didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened slightly. "That's a very dramatic version of events." Keanu sat down slowly. "That script meant something. It still does. I want to bring it back, with proper credit. This isn't about lawsuits, it's about truth." Dean's reply was quiet, but firm. "That film was a risk then. It's a liability now. Let it go, Keanu." But Keanu didn't move. He just stared, not with anger, but with a weight Dean hadn't expected. Keanu let the silence linger longer than most would have dared in that sterile corporate room. His gaze didn't waver from Dean Mercer's. There was no shouting, no accusations, just a stillness that forced the others to sit straighter in their chairs. "I'm not here to threaten," Keanu finally said, "but I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen. That script wasn't just a story. It was someone's soul on paper. You buried it, and in doing so, you buried a man." Dean glanced at the two lawyers, then folded his hands. "Keanu, I respect you. Everyone does. But the business has changed. That project was deemed unmarketable, overly quiet, lacking commercial potential. The writer was difficult. We all moved on." "No," Keanu said softly. "He didn't." One of the lawyers interrupted. "Mr. Reeves, legally, the studio owns the footage and the draft script version that was signed under contract. Any disputes over authorship would be challenging to revisit after so many years." "I'm not trying to sue," Keanu replied, calm but unwavering. "I want to fund a restoration, give credit, release it on my own terms if I have to. If the studio wants to decline, that's your call. But it will be known. The world will know the story behind Quiet Season, and the man who wrote it." Dean stood abruptly, walking to the window. The light hit half his face, casting the other in shadow. "Do you know how many unfinished films gathered dust in this town?" he muttered. "How many brilliant voices got crushed because they didn't play the game? This isn't new. It's just how it works." Keanu stood as well. "Then maybe it's time it stopped working that way." Dean turned back, eyes hard now. "Why are you doing this? Out of guilt? Nostalgia?" Keanu shook his head. "Because he didn't stop believing, even when the world forgot him. That kind of faith deserves a second chance." The room tensed. The lawyers exchanged looks but said nothing. Dean took a slow breath and walked toward the door. "We'll review the footage and internal rights. Don't expect miracles." Keanu paused on his way out. "I don't expect miracles, just decency." Outside, the air felt sharper. Keanu walked past his assistant without a word. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes said it all. He was in. And he wasn't walking away. That night, Keanu sat in his home office, a single lamp glowing as the rest of the house slept. On the desk before him lay two items: a faded production still from Quiet Season and a printout of Thomas Langley's handwritten script notes. He ran his fingers over the paper. Not printed, not formatted, just scrawled thoughts from a man who still believed stories could heal. The studio hadn't outright said no, but they hadn't said yes either. He knew what that meant. Delay, deflection, hoping he'd let it go. But he wouldn't. The next morning, Keanu made a call to his lawyer. Not for litigation, but for guidance. I want to know exactly what they own and what they don't. He also called his archivist. Pull everything we have on quiet season. Shooting schedules, behind-the-scenes footage, even those old mini DV tapes. Then he called Thomas. Damon didn't say no, Keanu told him over the phone. But they're scared. Scared of a story? Thomas asked, his voice still rough but clearer than before. Scared of what the truth makes them look like. There was a long pause on the line. Then Thomas said, if this actually happens, if people finally see what we made, that I will, Keanu promised, one way or another. 2 days later, an envelope arrived on Keanu's doorstep. Inside were 3 Polaroids. Thomas on set, laughing with the original director, standing by the camera with the clapperboard marked Quiet Season, Scene 12B, and beneath that a short note in Thomas's handwriting. This was the best I ever felt in my life. Thank you for remembering it mattered. Keanu pinned the photos to the corkboard above his desk. Meanwhile, the studio issued a quiet press release. Just a footnote in a Friday media dump. We are working in collaboration with Mr. Keanu Reeves on the restoration of an archived project, tentatively titled Quiet Season. Further updates to follow. The statement didn't mention Thomas. No acknowledgement of the man who wrote the words. But it didn't matter, because the next move belonged to Keanu, and he had already made it. On his personal social media, usually empty save for occasional charity posts, he shared a still image from the lost film, just a single-line caption beneath it. Some stories were never meant to stay silent. Thousands of shares, tens of thousands of comments. Hollywood had tried to erase a name, but now the world was starting to remember it. The first time Thomas saw himself in a mirror after the haircut, he blinked like he didn't recognize the man staring back. Gone was the overgrown beard, the tangled hair matted from years of neglect. In its place stood a face lined with age and exhaustion, yes, but also dignity. His eyes looked sunken but clearer. His jaw, though thinner, carried a quiet strength. His new clothes weren't flashy, just a soft gray sweater, dark jeans, and a pair of sturdy shoes that fit. But to Thomas, they felt foreign, like a borrowed identity he wasn't sure he deserved to wear. Keanu had arranged it all quietly, refusing to make a spectacle of the gesture. No camera crews, no social media posts, just one call to a friend who owned a modest apartment above a bookstore in Santa Monica. The friend owed Keanu a favor. The apartment had a tiny balcony, a clean kitchen, and the kind of silence that didn't feel lonely. For Thomas, it felt like air after being underwater for years. The first night in that apartment, Thomas stood in the kitchen holding a steaming mug of chamomile tea, the scent unfamiliar but calming. On the counter sat a notepad. A small note in Keanu's unmistakable handwriting read, "Pages belong here." It was just a few words, but it shook something loose inside him. For years, Thomas had scribbled ideas on napkins, cardboard scraps, and the margins of discarded newspapers. He had never dared to write anything serious again. But now, on that small desk in the corner of the room, there was a lamp, fresh paper, and a seat with his name on it. If he was ready. A few days later, Keanu returned. This time he brought Maya, his assistant, who had taken on the task of coordinating what came next. They brought a manila folder filled with documents and outlined the plan. A documentary, not just about Quiet Season, but about the truth behind its disappearance and the man who had written it. Thomas sat motionless on the couch, listening. When Keanu finally said the words, "co-producer credit," he flinched. "I'm calling it Quiet Season, reclaimed," Keanu said, his voice low but certain. "You deserve your name back." Thomas looked down at his hands, which were trembling. "I'm not used to being seen," he said softly. Keanu didn't try to argue, he just nodded. "You will be." And for the first time in decades, Thomas didn't feel invisible. Thomas kept the folder unopened on his kitchen table for hours after Keanu and Maya left. The co-producer credit was more than just a title. It was an acknowledgement that he hadn't imagined his past, that his voice still mattered. But with that acknowledgement came fear. What if he wasn't ready to return? What if he failed again? Only this time, in front of the very people who had pulled him out of the shadows? That evening, he walked down to the corner bookstore beneath his new apartment. The scent of paper and dust filled the air, grounding him. He wandered to the film and media section and paused by a shelf, where a single copy of an old industry directory sat wedged between biographies. Flipping through it, he found his name. Thomas Langley. 2 credits, 1 nomination. A listing that hadn't been updated since 1997. The world had moved on without him, but somehow the record still stood. He ran a finger down the page like he was touching a scar. The next day, Thomas met with Maya again to go over production timelines. She brought coffee, but he barely touched it. His hands were busy fidgeting with the corner of the contract. At one point, he looked at her and said, "Why would anyone care what happened to me?" Maya didn't respond right away. She just pulled out her phone and opened a text. "This is from a film student I met at a panel a year ago," she said, showing him a screenshot. It read, "I wish more stories were about silence, about what happens when nothing is left to say. Movies now feel loud all the time. I crave something that lets me breathe." Then she looked him in the eye. "That's why, because what you wrote still matters. It just needed someone to believe in it again." Thomas said nothing. But that night he opened the manila folder. Inside was a tentative schedule, a script for the documentary narration, and his new credit line. Thomas Langley, co-producer and original writer. His fingers hovered over the words like they were sacred. He read every page slowly, methodically, absorbing not just the content, but the care it took to assemble it. This wasn't charity. This was restoration. Later that week, Keanu returned with a film crew for early interviews. Thomas sat beneath a soft overhead light, eyes focused but unsure. The interviewer asked him, "What's the first thing you want people to know about Quiet Season?" He hesitated. Then, quietly, he said that it was written by someone who believed pain could be beautiful, that silence isn't the absence of meaning, it's often where the truth hides. There was a long pause. No one spoke. The camera stayed on him, recording not just his words, but the weight behind them. In that moment, Thomas Langley was no longer a forgotten name. He was a voice, clear, trembling, and finally heard. The studio set for the documentary was modest. Just black curtains, soft lighting, and a few props from the original Quiet Season shoot that Keanu had tracked down. A rusted bench, a pair of faded hiking boots, an old typewriter with a cracked key, the same model Thomas had used back in the early 90s when writing the script. Thomas stepped onto the set like he was walking into a memory. His hands trembled as he sat beside the boots. The director asked if he wanted to hold the script pages for the interview. He declined. "I know them by heart," he said. "I've carried them longer than anyone realizes." As the cameras rolled, Thomas spoke, not like a man defending his legacy, but like one finally reclaiming it. He told stories of the original writing process, how he'd written scenes during overnight hospital shifts while his best friend Daniel was slowly dying of ALS, how the silence in the script wasn't artistic flair, but a reflection of the things Daniel could no longer say near the end. Every line, every pause was intentional. When asked why he never tried to rewrite the script into something more commercial after the studio rejected it, Thomas didn't hesitate. Because grief isn't something you sell, it's something you honor. Keanu watched the interview from the side of the set. His eyes didn't leave Thomas once. There was something profoundly humbling about watching this man, once discarded by the very industry they both belonged to, speak with such unwavering clarity. No bitterness, no theatrics, just truth. After the interview, Keanu approached and handed Thomas a small, wrapped box. Inside was an embossed, leather-bound copy of the Quiet Season script, clean, restored, and formatted for distribution. On the inside cover was a note in Keanu's handwriting. "This story deserves to be seen, but more than that, you deserve to be known." Thomas swallowed hard and looked down. "I don't know what to say." Keanu smiled. "You already did." Later that evening, as the crew packed up and the lights dimmed, Thomas stayed behind a few minutes longer. He walked slowly to the bench prop and sat down. The camera had stopped rolling, but something in him wasn't ready to let go just yet. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the worn copy of the original script, the one he'd carried for over 2 decades, dog-eared and stained by time. He placed it gently on the bench beside the clean new version Keanu had given him. The past and the present, broken and restored. Then he stood, took one last look at the set, and whispered, "Daniel, we made it." It wasn't just about a film anymore. It was about a promise kept, a name reclaimed, a man returned, and the world finally was listening. The camera crew arrived early, the air still crisp with morning mist as the lights were set and chairs arranged. Keanu stood quietly in the corner, reviewing the list of names. They were all there. Actors, lighting techs, editors, even a few interns from the original Quiet Season set. Each had agreed to speak on camera. Not one had hesitated. It said everything. Thomas sat off to the side, dressed simply, his shoulders a little straighter than they'd been a week ago. He said very little, only nodded when the first interview began. A former grip, now retired, looked into the lens and spoke gently. "We all knew there was something about Thomas's script. It was honest, raw. Nobody writes about silence like that anymore." One by one, the voices came forward. A costume designer recalled Thomas staying up late on set, adjusting character arcs with the director. An assistant editor remembered how Thomas mailed her a handwritten thank you note after post-wrapped, thanking her for saving a quiet scene he thought would be cut. Everyone remembered him, not just the writing, but the way he treated people. Keanu watched the footage on a monitor in the next room. He wasn't in many shots. This wasn't about him. It never was. Then Thomas's old mentor arrived. He looked older than Thomas remembered. Gray, hunched, cautious. But the moment their eyes met, years peeled away. He reached out to touch Thomas's arm and whispered, "I should have fought harder." The cameras captured the tears silently falling as the mentor sat down and shared the story of a young man who wrote with soul. "He brought me a scene once," the mentor recalled. "No dialogue, just a woman standing by a lake. I read it 3 times, and each time, I cried." In the days that followed, Keanu's assistant Maya began uploading small clips to the production's social media. Just a few seconds here and there, someone mentioning Thomas's talent, or a behind-the-scenes moment from Quiet Season. One video, a close-up of the handwritten script pages, drew hundreds of comments within hours. Another clip, just Thomas walking silently past the camera, was shared thousands of times. And then came the question, who is Thomas Langley? It trended on platforms that had never heard his name before. Articles popped up, Reddit threads speculated, former classmates reached out. Someone posted an old college photo of Thomas, arms around friends, holding a student award in his hand. The caption read, "He was always the real thing." Thomas didn't say much when the clip started going viral. Maya showed him a few of the comments, people expressing shock, sympathy, admiration, but he just smiled softly and turned away. The internet moves fast," he murmured. "Let's see if it stays." But it did. In fact, it grew. A well-known journalist from a respected entertainment magazine called Keanu's office, asking for an interview. "We want to know about Quiet Season and the man who wrote it." Keanu declined the interview, but he gave them a quote. "Thomas Langley never stopped being a writer. The world just forgot how to read him." The quote went viral. More people started sharing their stories. Actors who had worked with Thomas on small projects in the early 90s, young screenwriters who remembered his name from old workshop programs. One woman posted a scanned postcard she'd received after a writing seminar. "Your voice matters. Don't let the loud ones drown it out. T.L." Thomas watched the momentum build with cautious eyes. Fame had never been the goal. Recognition, maybe, but he was older now. All he wanted was for the story to live again. Not just Quiet Season, but the idea that truth and silence still had value in a world obsessed with noise. Meanwhile, Maya continued shaping the documentary's online presence. She posted a video titled "The Script That Wouldn't Die," a quiet, slow-moving montage of Thomas's pages, the original film footage, and audio clips of the cast reading favorite lines aloud. The video ended with a single frame. Thomas's name typed across a faded script cover. It exploded across social media. Hollywood began to pay attention. People who had once worked at the studio started reaching out, some apologizing anonymously, others confirming the rumors that had long swirled behind closed doors. One former legal assistant even provided a scanned memo dated 1996. It confirmed the worst. "Terminate all professional associations with T. Langley. Internal review not required." Keanu saw the memo and closed his eyes for a long moment. It was one thing to hear the stories, another to see the evidence in print. When Thomas read it, he didn't react with anger, just a quiet nod. "That's the paper that took my name," he said. "Now we write something new." That night, Keanu gathered the documentary team in the office. He looked around at the faces, old and young, seasoned and new. He said just one thing: "We're not just making a film, we're giving someone back their story." And for the first time in decades, Thomas Langley felt the pages turning in his favor. 2 weeks later, filming resumed at a small soundstage in Burbank. Keanu stood behind the camera this time, letting Thomas sit under the lights. Maya gently adjusted the mic on his collar, gave him a reassuring nod, and stepped aside. The interviewer began softly, "When did you realize you were going to lose everything?" Thomas leaned back, his fingers laced together in his lap. "It wasn't all at once," he said. "It's like standing in a house during a quiet earthquake. You think maybe it's the wind, maybe it'll pass. Then the pictures fall off the wall, and you realize the foundation's already cracked." Silence lingered, not uncomfortable, just full. He went on to speak about the choices that defined him. His refusal to change Quiet Season into something it wasn't. His friend's memory. The years spent hoping someone would care. When the session ended, Thomas stood up slowly. Maya handed him a bottle of water, and for the first time he smiled fully. "That felt right," he said, like speaking through the noise. As the crew packed up, Keanu took a quiet walk with him around the block. The sun was setting. Orange light hit the tops of buildings like fire. Thomas stopped suddenly and pointed at a small mural on the alley wall. A painting of an open book, its pages flying upward like birds. "I used to believe in signs," he said. Keanu looked at the mural, then at him. "I still do." The next morning, Maya uploaded the new clip of Thomas's interview. Within hours, the hashtag Quiet Season began trending. People weren't just watching anymore, they were asking questions. Who else had been silenced? How many voices had Hollywood buried for the sake of marketability? Keanu sat in his office later that afternoon, reviewing another cut of the documentary. The editing was simple, elegant. No gimmicks, just people telling the truth. He paused the footage on a still frame of Thomas, looking directly into the lens, unblinking. Then he whispered, as if the man could hear him through the screen, "This time, they're going to listen." Outside, the sun dipped low over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the studio floor. But for the first time in decades, a voice once lost was rising again, and the world was finally ready to hear it. The letter arrived on thick ivory paper, sealed with the embossed logo of a law firm so elite it didn't advertise. It didn't need to. The words on the page were as sharp as a knife. Cease and desist. Immediate termination of all documentary efforts. Legal action pending. Keanu sat at the end of a long table in his private meeting room, the letter unfolded in front of him. Maya hovered nearby, jaw clenched. Across from him, his legal advisor, Alan Richter, a calm but fearless litigator, skimmed the contents again, brows furrowing deeper with each line. "They're going for intimidation," Alan said finally. "No specific legal ground, just implied threats. But they know if they drag this out in court, it'll be messy." Keanu didn't speak. His fingers tapped the table lightly, then stopped. "It's from Mercer, right?" Alan nodded. "Signed directly. Dean Mercer's making this personal." Keanu looked away, eyes landing on a nearby printout of the original Quiet Season script. The title, faded from years of storage, now sat framed beside the original production notes. Newly recovered from his storage unit. He hadn't told Thomas yet about the letter. He didn't want to discourage him. Not after everything they'd started. The documentary had already captured attention. Maya's carefully curated clips, snippets of interviews, behind-the-scenes footage, even a short video of Thomas explaining the inspiration behind a scene, had gone viral. Thousands of comments flooded in. Some people asked where they could watch the full film. Others asked how Thomas had been forgotten in the first place. But Mercer had seen it too, and clearly he was rattled. "He's worried about exposure," Alan continued, "and damage. If what we've learned is true, and you're serious about going public with that memo." "I'm serious," Keanu interrupted. His voice was steady, but there was steel behind it. Alan gave a short nod. "Then we have leverage. But you need to be ready for them to dig into you too. They'll smear him, and they'll try to smear you by association." Keanu leaned forward. "Let them. I've lived enough of my life hiding from the wrong fights. Not this one." There was a pause. Then Alan slid the folder shut and leaned back in his chair. "All right, then let's prepare to respond." Later that night, Keanu walked the edge of the beach outside his home, the waves rolling in slow rhythm. He could still hear Mercer's voice in his head. Cold. Rehearsed. Arrogant. "This is your legacy you're gambling, Keanu. People don't want to remember failures." He had only one answer. Maybe it's time they do. The following morning, Maya walked into Keanu's office with a printout in her hand and eyes wide. "You need to see this," she said, her voice low but urgent. Keanu glanced up from the stack of legal files and gestured for her to come closer. She handed him a leaked email thread, time-stamped and authenticated. The sender, a former assistant to Dean Mercer. The subject line read, R.E. Langley situation. Keanu read every word. His jaw tightened. The message detailed an internal memo from 1996, instructing executives to disassociate from Thomas Langley, effective immediately. It included phrases like potential liability, refused to adapt script to studio's direction, and most damning, censure future projects do not include his name in credits, formally or informally. It was clear, calculated blacklisting. There it was, in cold ink on corporate letterhead. Proof that Thomas Langley had been buried, not for misconduct, but for daring to protect the soul of his story. Maya's voice cracked slightly. It was never about a contract dispute. They wanted him erased. Keanu nodded slowly, then set the printout down with care. "We go public," he said quietly. This can't stay in the dark. That afternoon, Keanu met with Thomas at the editing suite. The older man was hunched over notes, reviewing sound design ideas for one of the unfinished scenes. When Keanu placed the memo on the table, Thomas stared at it for a long time. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. "I always suspected," Thomas said, "but part of me hoped. It wasn't that deliberate." "It was," Keanu confirmed. "But now we have proof. And you have your name." Thomas didn't cry. He didn't speak for a full minute. Then he reached over and closed the folder. "I never thought I'd see the day." Keanu sat beside him. "You're going to see it. All of it." That evening, Keanu's legal team issued a response. Clear, firm, public. They cited the leaked memo, the original contracts, and a clause in the film's archival rights that gave Keanu partial authority to republish footage with consent from one original screenwriter, Thomas. It was a quiet bomb dropped on the Hollywood press. By morning, headlines blazed across industry blogs and social platforms. Keanu Reeves stands up against blacklisting in stunning film revival. Buried film, buried career, now resurrected. And perhaps most poignantly, Thomas Langley was erased. Until now. The next few days unfolded like a whirlwind. While the studio scrambled for damage control, public sentiment leaned heavily in Keanu and Thomas's favor. Comments poured in beneath Maya's documentary clips, heartfelt, angry, inspired. People shared their own stories of being silenced, overlooked, pushed aside by power structures. Ennis, once invisible, was now being seen everywhere. A film critic from a major publication published an op-ed titled "The Genius We Never Got to See," breaking down Thomas's original draft of Quiet Season and comparing it to the leaked production notes. The article praised the script's humanity, its restraint, its raw truth. It ended with a line that went viral. "If this is what we lost, what else have we buried under fear?" Keanu sat with Thomas in the screening room one evening, watching another restored scene. The dialogue played out quietly. Two characters sitting in silence on a snowy porch, mourning a lost friend. "I wrote that for David," Thomas whispered. "He used to sit like that when he couldn't talk anymore." ALS took his voice before it took his life. Keanu didn't speak. He just nodded, letting the moment be what it was. Pure, unfiltered grief turned into art. Later that night, Thomas walked alone on the studio lot for the first time in decades. The same pavement he'd once crossed with hope in his eyes, carrying fresh pages under his arm, now felt like reclaimed ground. He paused near the gate, took out a pen, and scribbled something in the corner of his notebook. Maya approached from a distance, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you didn't like crowds," she teased gently. "I don't," Thomas replied, his smile faint. "But I'm learning not to disappear from them either." Behind them, the crew continued working on the documentary's final segment. Keanu was speaking to a journalist in the editing room, calmly defending Thomas, the story, and the right to make wrongs right, no matter how many years had passed. In an unexpected twist, a junior studio exec who had admired Keanu's earlier advocacy work reached out privately. He offered a proposal, a limited theatrical release of Quiet Season, with Thomas credited as sole screenwriter and co-producer. It wasn't just a concession, it was validation. When Keanu relayed the offer to Thomas, the older man went silent again. This time, the silence wasn't grief. It was disbelief. Then, after a long breath, Thomas said softly, "Let's finish what we started." The ripple began with a single tweet. Maya had posted a short clip, just 15 seconds, of Thomas sitting in a dimly lit studio, flipping through the weathered pages of Quiet Season. No fancy editing, no dramatic score, just him quietly saying, "This story was all I had left." Within hours, the clip had been shared over 10,000 times. Industry accounts picked it up. Fans of Keanu's older work started asking questions, and then came the headlines. Forgotten writer's script returns from the dead, with Keanu's help. Homeless man turns out to be screenwriter behind Lost 90s film. Keanu Reeves revives buried masterpiece. By morning, Thomas Langley was trending. The studio hadn't been ready, neither had Thomas. He'd never seen his name praised publicly, not like this, not with such sincerity. At first, he was hesitant to watch the coverage, but Maya sat with him in the editing room, laptop balanced between them, refreshing the screen every few minutes. Thomas watched the videos quietly. The interviewer on one channel said, "You were wronged. You were robbed of your voice." Thomas answered simply, "Maybe, but sometimes the voice stays alive, even if the world doesn't hear it for a while." Maya wiped a tear when he said it. He didn't like being called a homeless genius or a tragic figure. He winced when one blog listed all the years he'd been missing from the scene. "Might make it sound like I died," he told Maya. "But you didn't," she said. "You survived." He received an invitation to appear on a morning talk show. Another outlet wanted an exclusive. He declined them all, not out of bitterness, but because he didn't want to turn his story into a spectacle. "I want the work to speak," he said. Keanu understood. Instead of chasing publicity, they focused on the documentary. Maya continued recording behind-the-scenes footage. Keanu scheduled sit-down interviews with other actors from the original film, as well as with crew members who remembered Thomas's name from decades past. One of the old grips, now retired, told the camera, "That guy was the heart of the story. We all knew it. We just didn't know what happened to him." A well-known actress from the original cast broke down in tears mid-interview. "Hem was always kind. Always listening. He wrote with so much grace," she said. "It hurts to know we forgot him." Thomas watched that interview in silence. Then came the call from a journalist working on a deep dive piece for The Hollywood Reporter. They requested an on-camera interview. Thomas almost refused. But Keanu asked him to consider it. "Not for the sake of fame, but for the sake of truth. You lived this, you carried it, you deserve to tell it." The studio lights were harsh that day and the microphone felt intrusive. But when the interviewer asked, "Do you feel vindicated?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "No," he said. "I feel real. For the first time in decades." Keanu, watching from behind the camera, didn't say a word. He just smiled softly. Because in that moment, Thomas Langley wasn't a ghost. He was a name the world had remembered. The next day, something unexpected happened. Letters started arriving. Actual handwritten letters, mailed to the production office in Los Angeles. Dozens of them at first, then hundreds. Some were from young screenwriters, thanking Thomas for giving them hope. Others were from retired stagehands and anonymous former studio workers who remembered the injustice. One woman wrote, "I was in the room when they shut your project down. I regret staying silent." Thomas read every letter. He kept them in a shoebox Maya had labeled Echoes. Keanu had seen fan mail before, but this was different. There was no idol worship here, no glamour, just raw humanity. People connecting with a man they once walked past on the street, never realizing who he was. An old director wrote, "When I was blacklisted in the 70s, no one came for me. But I see now the world has changed, maybe just enough." Thomas taped a few letters above his temporary desk. The kind words didn't erase the pain, but they softened it. Keanu's team began receiving calls from indie film festivals. They wanted to screen Quiet Season, not just as an old, rediscovered gem, but as a statement. A story that spoke to everything the industry often ignored. Even the Academy Museum reached out, asking if Thomas would consider participating in a panel discussion about lost cinema and artistic censorship. Thomas shook his head when he heard that. "I'm no historian," he told Keanu. Keanu responded, "You're living history." For every bit of attention, Thomas remained cautious. The past had taught him how quickly the spotlight could burn, but this time, something was different. This wasn't about promotion. This was about healing. Maya convinced him to share one last post on the project's blog, a letter from Thomas, typed in courier font and signed by hand. It read, "To everyone who ever thought their story didn't matter, who were told they were too difficult, too quiet, too broken, you matter. The world may forget you, but your voice remains. Write it, speak it, and when the time comes, let it be heard." It was shared 50,000 times in a single weekend. That night, Keanu and Thomas sat together on the office balcony, watching the city lights blink in quiet rhythm. Keanu passed him a cup of warm tea. "You okay?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "I'm not angry anymore, just tired. But it's the good kind of tired." They didn't speak for a while after that. Sometimes silence was the only language that understood what they both had carried. And from that silence, something beautiful was finally being heard. In the weeks that followed, Quiet Season became more than just a lost film. It became a conversation. Colleges began screening it in film ethics classes. Critics wrote think pieces titled "The Art Hollywood Buried" and "How One Man's Silence Spoke Louder Than a Studio." A small theater in New York ran the film for one night only. Every seat filled, not with celebrities but with artists, students, and people who had once thought their own stories would never matter. Keanu received an invitation to attend but quietly declined. He told Thomas, "This isn't about me anymore. They're coming for you." Thomas did go. He stood in the back of the theater during the final scene, his fingers clenched tightly together, trying to steady the emotions rising in his chest. The last shot faded to black. His shot. His story. And the room stayed silent. Then, a standing ovation. But Thomas didn't move. Someone recognized him and turned. One by one, heads followed. People applauded again, louder this time, but not with frenzy. It was a kind of reverence, a collective apology, a recognition long overdue. A young man approached him, eyes wide. "Mr. Langley," he said, "thank you. I saw myself in that story." Thomas finally smiled. For years, he'd been invisible, his work dismissed, his name buried, his voice silenced. Now he was seen. And more importantly, he was heard. Later that night, when he called Keanu to describe it all, he didn't speak for the first few seconds. Keanu waited. Finally, Thomas simply said, "It lived." Keanu replied softly, "So did you." Back in Los Angeles, Maya updated the documentary website with one final post. A short clip of Thomas watching the end credits of Quiet Season, his name restored, his eyes wet but calm. No music played, just the soft hum of the projector and a long pause as the frame lingered on the final title card. For the voices we tried to erase. You were never gone. And in that stillness, as quiet as the alley where it all began, a forgotten writer took his place among those who refused to be erased. The marquee glowed soft amber in the cool night air, casting gentle halos of light on the quiet sidewalk outside the Avalon Theater in Los Angeles. It wasn't a press-heavy premiere, no flashing paparazzi, no roaring crowd, just a modest gathering of those who mattered. The overlooked, the forgotten, the believers. Keanu stood near the entrance, dressed simply in black. He didn't need to be the center of attention. Tonight wasn't about him. It was about Thomas Langley. And Thomas, for the first time in years, looked like he belonged somewhere. His hair was neatly trimmed, beard shaved down to a gentle stubble. The navy suit wasn't new, but it was pressed and clean, borrowed from Keanu's personal tailor. A small red pocket square gave it life. He walked slowly toward the doors, his eyes tracing every detail around him, as if still unsure it was real. A line had formed, young screenwriters from mentorship programs, actors who had been inspired by the leaked footage of Quiet Season, crew members who had once worked silently in the background. Among them were familiar faces from shelters and community centers, people who had seen their own pain in Thomas's words. As Thomas reached the entrance, he hesitated. Keanu extended a hand. No words, just a gesture. Thomas took it. Inside the theater, the energy was hushed, anticipation laced with reverence. There were no promotional posters, just a single screen with two simple words in pale serif letters: "Quiet season." The lights dimmed. The restored footage opened with silence, then snow, then the slow unraveling of a man's grief in long, still shots that invited the audience to breathe with the characters, to feel the absence more than the action. Keanu's performance, understated and raw, was matched only by the power of the script. Thomas sat 3 rows from the back, hands clasped. His chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate rhythm. Once or twice he looked away, not because he was ashamed, but because the memories came too fast, too sharp. Every scene was a page he had once written in a small apartment filled with hope. Every line of dialogue was a voice he hadn't heard in decades. As the film played on, the silence in the room deepened, not out of boredom or confusion, but out of shared reverence, the kind of silence that only happens when people are holding their breath, not wanting to miss a single second. There was a moment, midway through the film, when the protagonist, played by a younger Keanu, sat in an empty kitchen, staring at a cracked teacup. No words, just stillness. And from the back of the theater, someone sniffled. Then another, a quiet chain reaction of tears. Thomas noticed. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply sat there, shoulders squared, as if bearing witness to something holy. When the credits finally rolled, the room remained motionless. No one moved. No one reached for their phones. The lights came up slowly, warm and soft, revealing rows of damp eyes and trembling hands. And then, someone clapped. A single pair of hands in the second row, then another. Then the room erupted, not in wild celebration, but in something deeper. A standing ovation of gratitude, of quiet justice, of acknowledgement that a story thought lost had returned, and with it, the man who had written it. Thomas stood, unsure what to do. He turned slowly to face the room. Every person stood with him, every eye was on him. Keanu remained seated, watching his friend from the shadows. He had already had his applause in life. Tonight was about someone else. Thomas stepped forward, just one pace. He raised a hand, not to wave, but to ask for quiet. The room obeyed. He looked across the sea of faces, each reflecting back something he hadn't seen in years. Dignity. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Thank you for hearing me." No speech, no ego, just 7 words that carried the weight of a lifetime. Afterward, people didn't rush to take selfies. They came forward to shake his hand, to say thank you, to tell him how much the story meant to them. One young woman clutched a dog-eared notebook and said, "I was going to quit writing, but not after tonight." An older man from the shelter stood near the exit, tears in his eyes. "You made me feel seen," he whispered. Outside, as the night air cooled the sidewalks, Keanu joined Thomas by the curb. "That was beautiful," Keanu said. Thomas gave a tired smile. "They heard it." "That is," Keanu replied. "And they'll keep hearing it." Thomas nodded, then looked up at the stars, the same way he had on the night Keanu first found him in the alley. "I never thought I'd see this day," he said. Keanu put a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't see it, you made it." They didn't speak much after that. There wasn't a need. Some stories end with loud celebration. This one ended with a man reclaiming his voice. And that was enough. The buzz from the screening hadn't yet faded when Keanu sat across from Thomas again, this time in a quiet office overlooking a courtyard shaded by eucalyptus trees. There was no red carpet, no flash of cameras, just 2 men, one newly seen, the other ready to open a door that had been shut for too long. Keanu slid a folder across the table. Inside was a formal offer, a mentorship position at his production company. Not just a title, but a platform, a role that gave Thomas access to projects in development, young writers looking for guidance, and a new title he had once believed would never be his again: creative consultant. Thomas stared at the papers, his fingers trembling slightly. He had once signed contracts with ease. Now the weight of these few pages felt like a mountain. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the prestige. It was something far more difficult to accept. "I'm honored," Thomas said slowly. "But I don't want to sit at this table alone." Keanu tilted his head, curious. "I want to bring others with me, people like me, people who've been silenced, forgotten, who once had stories but no stage." Keanu listened. Thomas continued. "There are kids in shelters writing poetry on pizza boxes, veterans with notebooks full of scripts, survivors who journal because no one else will hear them. If I take this seat, I want them beside me." Keanu leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. What would that look like? Thomas smiled faintly, the first real one Keanu had seen from him. "A writing lab. A place for those who've been overlooked. No resumes, just voices. We give them tools, time, and someone to say, 'Your story matters.'" Silence filled the room. But it wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. Keanu nodded. "Then let's build it." That's how the Quiet Voices Initiative was born. Not as a PR stunt or corporate campaign, but as a quiet rebellion against a system that had once erased Thomas. Together, they drafted the mission statement that night: to amplify voices lost in the noise, to honor stories that almost disappeared, to turn silence into narrative. The rollout began modestly. A single room in Keanu's production office was converted into a writing space. Warm lighting, second-hand couches, a wall of donated books, and a whiteboard scribbled with story prompts like, "What made you silent?" and "Who do you write for?" Thomas insisted that the space be accessible. No security guards, no glossy branding, just a kettle for tea, stacks of composition notebooks, and a schedule taped to the door. Word spread quickly through outreach teams in shelters, community centers, and transitional housing programs. Within 2 weeks, 8 people had shown up. One was a woman named Daria, a former foster youth who wrote poems about her time in group homes. Another was Reggie, a disabled veteran who carried a binder filled with short stories about war and recovery. Then there was Jaden, barely 20, who had been couch surfing and writing a screenplay about a boy who could hear people's regrets. Thomas met with each of them one-on-one. He didn't edit their words. He listened to them. Gently, he encouraged them to keep going. That was the difference. He didn't try to mold their voices. He helped them believe those voices had value. On the first Friday session, Thomas opened with something personal. He stood in front of the group, hands trembling just a little, and said, "I was told once that silence was failure, that if no one heard your story, it didn't count. But I know now that stories don't die in silence. They wait." He paused. "Some of you have been waiting a long time. I know. So did I. But you're here now, and that matters." Across the room, heads nodded. One participant wiped away tears. Maya, who had taken on a larger role in organizing the initiative, filmed that moment. She shared it online with a simple caption: "He waited 30 years to be heard. Now he's listening." The video quietly went viral, not because of drama, but because of truth. Donations came in. Screenwriting software companies offered licenses. A nearby arts nonprofit lent a second room. What began as a pilot program was suddenly gaining momentum. Still, Thomas kept it grounded. Each Saturday he arrived early, brewed coffee, and laid out notebooks. He greeted each participant by name. No red carpets, no headlines, just presence. One afternoon, Keanu stopped by unannounced. He didn't bring a camera crew or a publicist. He sat in the back of the room and listened as Reggie read a monologue from his newest script, a scene where a father returns home from war to a daughter who no longer recognizes him. When Reggie finished, the room was silent. Then Thomas clapped. The others followed. Keanu did too, eyes misted over. Later that day, Keanu said quietly to Thomas, "You didn't just survive, you transformed." Thomas looked back at him, eyes steady. "So did you." They said nothing more. They didn't need to. The room, the stories, the quiet voices rising, those were the proof. The sky was soft with morning light as Thomas Langley walked down Sunset Boulevard, the faint hum of the city trailing behind him like a half-remembered melody. He moved with quiet assurance now, shoulders square, coat crisp, a clean shave on his chin, and the unmistakable glint of purpose in his eyes. Tucked under his arm was a fresh script, printed on recycled paper and bound with a black clip. The title on the front read simply, "Sparrow Stillness." Beneath it, in modest type, written by T. Langley. 1 year ago, Thomas had drifted through these same streets, wrapped in layers of old coats and silence. Most people hadn't looked twice. Those who had looked away. Now glances lingered a little longer, not out of pity or curiosity, but recognition. He wasn't famous, he wasn't chasing the spotlight. But his story had been seen, and that changed everything. A barista pushing chairs outside a cafe paused mid-major, narrowing his eyes as if trying to place the man's face. A young girl across the street tapped her mother's arm and pointed, whispering something. Even a cyclist slowed down for a few seconds before continuing, puzzled. As Thomas neared a crosswalk near Fairfax, a young man in his 20s, wearing a worn UCLA film school hoodie, glanced up from his phone. His expression shifted as he took in the sight of the older man, the script under his arm, the walk of someone who had something to say. "Hey, excuse me," the student said, jogging a few steps to catch up. "Are you the guy who made Quiet Season?" Thomas turned, calm and patient. His smile was faint but full. "I helped," he said. The young man broke into a grin. "Man, I watched that 3 times. That scene, under the tree, no music, no words, just silence. I didn't know a film could feel like that. I didn't even know silence could speak so loud." Thomas nodded, visibly touched. "It wasn't just the silence," he said. "It was the stillness behind it. That's where stories live." The young man looked at the script tucked under Thomas's arm. "Is that your next one?" Thomas glanced down, thoughtful. "It is. What's it about?" Thomas paused, as if weighing how much to share. Then he smiled. "It's about a bird that sings softer than the wind, and someone finally hears it." The student nodded slowly, clearly moved. "Well, I can't wait to hear it." The light changed. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder before stepping off the curb and crossing the street. His gait was calm, steady. But he wasn't alone. Sitting on a low bench outside a used bookstore was Keanu Reeves. He wore sunglasses, a plain black jacket, and held a steaming cup of coffee in both hands. He had seen the entire exchange from across the intersection. He didn't wave. He didn't interrupt. He just watched, a small smile forming on his face, and nodded once. Not to say goodbye, but to say, keep going. The bookstore behind Keanu was one they had visited together months ago, back when Thomas was still unsure of himself, still apologizing for taking up space. They had browsed the shelves quietly, neither needing to fill the silence. Thomas had picked up an old copy of Rilke and run his fingers over the frayed spine. "He writes like he's listening to ghosts," he'd said. Keanu hadn't forgotten that. Today the bench held a different kind of silence. Not heavy, not fragile, just full. As Thomas crossed the street and spotted Keanu, he didn't stop walking. He simply nodded back. A silent greeting between men who had built something out of wreckage. Thomas didn't need encouragement anymore. And Keanu didn't need to speak to be understood. Thomas disappeared around the corner, the new script still tucked close to his ribs like something precious. A year ago, it would have been hidden, clutched tight in fear of being stolen or dismissed. Now, he carried it with ease, not like armor, like a gift. Inside the production office a few blocks away, Maya sat at her desk reviewing emails. One from a nonprofit workshop participant stood out. "Thank you," it read, "for letting someone like me write something that mattered. I thought I was just a kid with a record, but Mr. Langley read my story and said, 'You belong here.'" That moment saved me. She clicked star on the message and leaned back, her eyes misting slightly. The Quiet Voices initiative was no longer an idea, it was breathing. Later that afternoon, Thomas returned to the office to meet with a group of first-time writers from a nearby youth shelter. They gathered in a sunlit room, seated in a circle, notebooks open. One girl asked nervously, "What if nobody ever reads what we write?" Thomas smiled. "Write it anyway. Sometimes the act of writing is how we remember we exist." They leaned forward, hanging on every word. Across the hall, Keanu peeked through the glass and watched the scene unfold. A man once silenced, now giving others permission to speak. There was no red carpet, no camera crew, no headlines. But this was legacy. As the sun began to set, casting long amber shadows across the floor, Keanu quietly turned away and walked toward his own office. He passed by the editing suite, where quiet season had been restored frame by frame. The door was ajar, and he could hear soft, ambient music from the final cut. The kind of music that doesn't demand attention, but simply waits to be heard. He paused at the doorway, closed his eyes, and let the sound fill him. Redemption doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it shows up in the way a man walks, in the way he teaches, in the way he dares to begin again. Keanu opened his eyes, and somewhere down the hall, a quiet voice said, "Scene 1. Fade in." The early evening wind curled softly through the alleyways of downtown Los Angeles, brushing past dumpsters, faded graffiti, and old concert flyers that fluttered half-torn against the bricks. Keanu Reeves walked with quiet purpose, his steps steady but unhurried, guided more by memory than direction. The city buzzed in the distance, alive with car horns and distant chatter. But here, on this narrow street tucked between warehouses and forgotten buildings, the noise seemed to fade into something softer, something still. This was the alley, the same one. The streetlight still flickered above the cracked sidewalk, casting long, trembling shadows. The metal pole had rusted further since that first night. A fresh layer of graffiti curled across its base. But the feeling, that weight of quiet memory, it hadn't changed. Keanu reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped carefully in clear plastic. Inside was a fresh copy of the script, Quiet Season. Not the dusty draft that had once been passed over in boardrooms or shuffled aside by studio execs. This was the restored version. The one Thomas had once dreamed would exist in the world. The one that did, now. He crouched down slowly, knees cracking just a little, and placed the bundle gently on the concrete. It landed softly, like something sacred. He took a breath, steady and slow, and pulled out a folded note he had written the night before. "Treat anyone who thinks their voice doesn't matter, read this." He slipped the note between the script's cover and first page, then wrapped the plastic tight again to protect it from the coming night air. He adjusted it so it sat nestled in the corner where the building met the wall, sheltered from the breeze. For a long moment, Keanu didn't move. He just stared at the spot where Thomas Langley had once sat. Coat worn thin, eyes clouded with time, hands cradling what little hope he had left in the pages of that script. It hadn't looked like a second chance back then. It had looked like survival. And yet, the man who once whispered lines from a forgotten film had walked a red carpet, had spoken to a room full of young dreamers, had helped launch something new, something real. Keanu had watched Thomas come back to life, not with the thunder of fame or headlines, but with the quiet confidence of a soul finally heard. He stood, slowly. His gaze lingered on the script. No one else was around. There were no reporters, no admirers, no team members trailing behind. Just Keanu and the alley and the echo of a moment that had changed everything. A distant train rumbled. A dog barked a few blocks over. The streetlight above buzzed and blinked twice, then steadied. Keanu gave a soft nod, then turned and walked away. Behind him, quiet season waited, wrapped in plastic and hope, ready for someone else who needed to believe their words might still matter. The next morning, a young woman named Danny passed through the alley on her way to her third job. She was 22, just out of a community college program in creative writing, and had been sleeping on a friend's couch after her last eviction. Her backpack was torn, her shoes taped at the heels, but her eyes were still lit by something quietly defiant. She saw the package right away. Curious but cautious, she knelt down and peeled back the plastic, revealing the script inside. She almost laughed. Quiet season? She had never heard of it. But something about the handwriting on the folded note made her pause. To anyone who thinks their voice doesn't matter, read this. She sat right there on the concrete and opened the first page. 2 hours later, she was still sitting there, halfway through the story. She didn't notice the cold. She didn't notice the cars. She just read. Every word hit like a mirror she didn't expect. It was the first time in months she'd felt seen. Later, she'd call the contact number on the back flap. Keanu's nonprofit. And in a quiet room, weeks after, she'd read aloud a short scene of her own. Because stories don't end, they echo. They echo in alleys, in voices almost lost, in scripts wrapped in plastic and left for the next dreamer. Everyone deserves to be heard. Everyone deserves a second chance. Have you ever met someone the world gave up on too soon? Share their story below. What story do you want to see Keanu help tell next? Let us know in the comments.